Hey tribe, it's Gavin Seim here, and I'm excited about today's video. I've actually been prepping for this one all afternoon because we're going to talk about noise, or maybe we're going to talk about not noise, because probably what people have been telling you about noise, what you're thinking about noise, is over the top, and you really need to stop worrying about noise. You just need to do this instead. We're going to talk about why noise isn't actually a problem in 2022. We're also going to look maybe at some of these Fuji files. You've probably heard terms like too much noise and banding and worminess. If you shoot Fuji, you've heard worminess. Oh, use this software because of worminess. Use Capture One because it's not wormy. I'm gonna do a breakout video dealing specifically with worminess in the Fuji files. I don't wanna hate on the pixel peepers because I've been known to pixel peep, well, a lot. But the fact is, that over the years, as the cameras and the sensors and the software, the image processing has improved so much, I've realized that the aesthetic of an image is what matters. It's the way the print looks, it's the way the image looks, it's the way it looks in the context that you're displaying it. And oftentimes we put so much energy into these details and over-process our images for noise, and we're gonna stop that today. Let's actually go right here, and I'm gonna show you guys in Lightroom to start with. I have selected a whole bunch of images that are ideal for this, most of them high ISO and oftentimes downright difficult to deal with. Let's start by just taking a few images and give you guys a little bit of a backstory. If you think about noise, let's go to an image here. I took this a long time ago. In 2011. This was on a 5D Mark II, which was a camera from what, 2009, maybe 2010. This was shot at 25,600 up above the rim of the Grand Canyon where I was camping. And you see some stars and some cool stuff, but let's zoom in here to 200%. We're gonna be running 200% for purposes of this video, so that when people say, oh no this or oh no that, you can actually know what you're dealing with on your files, and we can dispel some of the fear mongering that goes around noise. And we can also show you, and what I'm gonna demonstrate today is that most of the time, the technique I'm gonna show you is better than fretting about noise. But wait and bear with me because you're gonna be surprised. I think you're gonna be amazed how much we can do with these simple tools. Not that tools like Topaz AI or Neat Image or anything like that. I have a lot of those in my arsenal. I occasionally use them if it's an image where I really need to do something special or it's really important to get it super clean for some reason. And some of these tools can be really great, but for most of your daily image processing, you don't need them, and I'm gonna show you that also. Look at this image on the 5D Mark II. Now it's important to note that even though the light's cool, we got some cool silhouettes, look at how much stuff is going on. Let me clean up my screen a little bit to show you more. Look at how much is going on down here. I know this is super high ISO. 25,000 in 2011 was a lot. It's a lot today, even though the full frames and even some of the smaller cameras are able to handle this really well. But this is a lot of noise. So if we're in here and we're looking at this, what happens if I go back? Let me show you where we were in Lightroom 1. I was there in Lightroom 1. I actually was making presets and packs for Lightroom 1. This is how this processed in Lightroom 1. Just look at this mess. This is what we had to deal with in Lightroom 1. A lot of you probably haven't gone back to Lightroom 1 processing in a long time. And as you know, if you look down here, you can go here and you can actually switch to version processing down in the calibration panel. This is what we had in Lightroom 1, in contrast to where we're at now, okay? Which is way cleaner, the color noise, the details. But you see on these old cameras, there was a lot of specular, especially on long exposures. I struggled with this a lot, like on some of my more known images that were long exposures, like 140 minutes of night. There was so much work to be done to try and get these like white dots that would appear. And I don't mean the star white dots, I mean the noise white dots. But I'm showing you this for a reason, because I want to take you and look at some of these newer images. What I'm going to show you will work on old images as well. But what I'm illustrating is that not only have the sensors improved a lot over the past 10, 12, 15 years, even though we were doing really good back then. You could get great images. I made a ton of great prints from that 5D. In fact, it's still sitting right there. It's been converted to infrared, and I still occasionally use it for tinkering around with infrared. Now you fast forward to 2022, we have a lot more sensor technology, but we also, whether you're using Lightroom or Capture One or maybe On One or Camera Raw or some other raw processing, we have a lot more ability to process these images. The subtleties of how it handles details are very important. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go straight into some images, both on full frame as well as on crop sensors. I've actually made some formulas, because you hear me talking about formulas a lot. I've made some noise and detail balancing formulas, and I'm going to put one of those, I'm actually going to put a few of those as an update, a free update for my Filmist pack, for those of you who use my Filmist presets for Lightroom or Capture One. However, bear with me, because I'm going to put a free one, and I'll put a link to the Filmist page down in the comments. If you download the latest free version, there's a freebie pack of Filmist that has like 8 or 10 presets. I'm going to add the formula that I'm making today into the Filmist free pack. And I'm also, as we go along, I'm going to show you what I'm doing and why. So if you want to download the preset and play with it and kind of make it easier and use the formula that I've put together for this, that's fine. So I'm going to edit these as I normally would. So like here, I'm gonna go into, it's a little bit dark, it's a little bit flat. I got a strobe scene, but I'm gonna go and do something like night strobe on this from Natural HDR4, just to enhance it a little bit from the flat version. But I'm also gonna push my exposure just a touch, then pull my highlights back just a little bit more than the preset did by default. But I'm not going to push this image hard. This is less about how we're editing the color on these images and more about the noise. Now remember, this is the Sony. This is an A7 III. More or less the same resolution as the Fuji crop sensors that we're going to be comparing to. So we're going to get a very real picture of the differences in the noise on these as well. If we come into here and I look at this and we look at the texture on the skin, in the background, we see some noise here. What I want to do is go down. If you look at this and we turn off noise reduction, sharpening, and grain, okay? Now we're looking at a more or less out of camera detail. This isn't actually the Lightroom defaults. I want to emphasize that Lightroom, Capture One, they actually have base defaults for noise reduction, for sharpening, and usually they're applying something automatically without asking you. And it's just the default. You can of course go in and manually change it. Normally I don't, because the default's there for a reason, but this is what this image looks like by default. And we could even turn off color noise reduction, which I don't recommend doing, because look at a high ISO image. High ISO images, even on modern sensors, fall apart very quickly without a little color noise reduction. And the color noise reduction does not have the side effects of losing a lot of detail like we see in a lot of others. Okay, so it's noisy, ISO 3200, but remember, we're looking at 200%. This would be a 1-to-1 ratio, and it looks pretty good throughout the image, even though we're in pretty strenuous conditions for the camera here. Now, but let's come in here and watch what happens. The first thing is, let's set the sharpening to default. When you see the sharpening go to default, you see the noise kind of increasing here as is expected. You're sharpening details. You actually see that, quote, worminess that people talk about on Fuji files, because what that actually is it's just kind of Lightroom sharpening noise or bringing out details. Now, of course, if we come in here, you can see that we can have the noise at default. I'm going to turn it up a little just as an example for now. We can change settings in the noise, like the radius of the pixels that it affects, larger or smaller, which can affect your details. I usually leave it around 0.9 to 1.1. You can control how much detail comes through, and of course, the more detail that comes through, the more artifacting you're going to get. I'm going to leave that at default settings for now, which is 25. You can also control masking. If I hold Alt or Option here and slide the masking, you're actually seeing a mask representation. As you turn masking up, the sharpening is affecting open areas less and only affecting lines around edges. The problem with that, you can see again, we're at 200%, but look what that's doing. It can be a good tool, but if you do it too much, you start seeing these distinct differences between the sharpened areas and the unsharpened areas. So if you mask, usually I'll keep masking fairly low, anywhere from 0 to maybe 20, to just kind of make it so it's a little bit less in the field areas than it is along the hard edges, but it's not going to solve your noise problem. So here we are, we're sharpened, and we still have noise. So what now? Hang on, let's look at it. Let's turn our sharpening down a little bit because I turned it up a little too high for emphasis. I'm gonna leave my sharpening at like 60. Let's go now to noise reduction. If I noise reduce this, what happens? Okay, I can put this at 50, right? Default on this image is 0. It's important to note that in Capture One, noise reduction is applied to most images by default. And so sometimes what people interpret as, oh, Capture One is better for this, or Lightroom is better for this, is actually just a difference in processing. By turning up the noise to 50, I start to get rid of a lot of this noise at ISO 3200 on the full frame. Maybe I don't even need that much. What if I noise reduce to about 30? If I turn it up to 100, I get a really smooth image, but it's so pasty that if you really need that much noise reduction, at that point, specialty plugins and AI tools might be a better fit for a particular image. But I'm here to tell you, stop doing that. There's very few cases where you need to reduce noise by that level. I remember back in the early digital days when noise could be so ugly that I developed an obsession. I did reviews and I tested. When I did the Pro Photo Show, I was always playing with these noise reduction tools. And guess what? I got some good results. But in the course of that, I think I got a little too obsessed with noise reduction. And over time, I realized that an organic process that feels natural, that feels a bit more like film, is actually better. Here's nothing, absolutely nothing, not default in Lightroom, okay? Right here. If I turn it back on, you see we're getting rid of color noise, we're cleaning things up a lot, our details a lot better. I mean, yeah, the processing we have today is pretty amazing. But I'm gonna show you the magic right now. I'm gonna show you how to take what's left of your noise and turn it into film. Not film. I know. Don't pick me apart in the comments. I'm gonna show you how to make it actually something that feels good. Ask yourself this: why am I paranoid about noise? What is it that I'm losing? Am I losing more by leaving it or by taking it away and actually losing detail in the image? Because remember, whether you crank the ISO or whether you shoot at a lower ISO and then have to push exposure in post, either way you're adding noise because you're bringing up those shadows, which is adding noise. Now we could talk about ISO and variance and all that, but the bottom line is the cameras usually have one or two ideal settings for noise that are their baselines, if you will. If you shoot at ISO 100 but then push 4 stops in post to get your light back, well, you're gonna see more noise. Either way, you're bringing up those details. I could do a lot of videos on this. If you guys want more videos on noise, we'll do them, but I want to keep moving so we don't make this too long. Back to 200%, okay? You've seen me doing all this stuff over here, and if you need to watch this in full screen, if it's too small, I'll upload this in 4K so you guys can watch in full screen if you need to. All I've been doing here since my basic preset process is simply coming in and doing a little sharpening, noise reduction. Now we're gonna go down the grain though, and this is where everything changes. I'm gonna put a little bit of grain on, okay? Now, a lot of times people put grain and they're very timid with it. I used to be very timid when I would add grain in Lightroom, like, oh no, I don't wanna lose my detail. The more time went on, I realized that grain, and also as the grain processes got better in our raw processors and in all of our tools, okay? I realized, and I remember back in the film days buying filters that would add more grain to give you a more organic feel. Yes, that was the film days. There was actually a filter, I can't even remember the name of it, that went over the film plane in my EOS 3 that I used to add more grain and give them a grainy aesthetic. That was film. Why did we need to do that? Watch what happens to this as I turn up the grain. Now we're losing, you're saying, okay, we're losing detail. Let's turn up really high. Now it's ugly. Let's turn the grain up to about 37%, 35, somewhere in there. Now let's make the size of the grain. If we make the size of the grain too small, it starts looking weirdy and artifacty like those early 5D Mark II images and their noise, right? Let's turn the size down a little bit and then control the roughness, okay? The roughness is kind of the intensity of the texture. And you can see if I turn it up really rough, again, don't go to 100. What's our default, 50? I'm gonna go just a little below that since this image isn't super, super noisy to begin with. Watch what we just did. Here to here. Remember, we're looking at 200%. You know what just happened? I just got an image that feels like film. A lot more than an image that feels like digital. I could process the heck out of this, but stop doing that. Because think about what you're actually trying to produce. When you start adding grain, you not only you not only hide artifacts because you're putting an even texture, that's what's happening, you're putting an even, more organic feeling texture across an image instead of weird little spots and artifacts like you see, you know, look at this around the hair and things like that. When you turn the grain on, you're adding texture throughout. We're zoomed in at 200%. To actually be seeing this level of detail in a print, I would be printing huge. I would be printing at 60 or 70 or 80 inches on this image. We've just transformed this image with just a little bit of grain. This to me feels digital, this feels grainy. Let me give you a case in point. These are actual scans from 4x5 film. And I wet scanned these in, shot on my Linhof, color and black and white scans here. And this is pretty cool because as we zoom in on these, and these are huge files, but as I zoom in on these, you're gonna see what I mean. And let me just bring you in. I've lifted this a little bit with a natural HDR preset to bring up the dynamic range, and there's a lot of it in this image. Let me just show you here. This was shot, as you can see, on Portra 160 on a 4x5 negative. Let's zoom in, and we can really zoom in. What do you see here? There's not really noise like we saw on the other image. The grain is very fine. Remember, this is a 4x5 negative, so way bigger than any of our full frame sensors, and it's scanned at like 20,000 pixels, like 130 megapixels or something like that. But look at this sky. What do you see? You see texture in that sky that's grainy, that's more like silver grains instead of artifacts and noise. Yes, I know there's some dust spots and some water spots and things from my scan. Look at the detail, ISO 160. That was a low ISO image. Now, if we were looking at really low ISO images, there's hardly any grain. I'm gonna show you that in a minute. But you can see how that affects our output. What we're doing by adding grain is more than just adding texture. Some people might argue, oh, you're taking away detail. Yes, if you add a lot of grain, you do affect your detail. But you're taking away detail when you reduce noise as well, even if you use really good AI or advanced noise processing tools. By adding the grain in, you're saying, let's do a little bit of noise reduction and then put some grain in so it just feels natural. Let's take an image that's a little bit lower ISO. Look at this image shot at ISO 500. This looks pretty good. Now, if you look here, I've actually made these presets in Filmist. I'm gonna reset right here my grain detail, and this is Filmist 1.3. So if you're a Filmist owner, make sure you have 1.3. And I'm gonna put this preset right here, which is basically the fundamentals of what I just showed you for dealing with a high ISO image, but in a preset, and I'm gonna put that for free in Filmist freebie pack. For this one, however, though, I'm gonna use less noise reduction because it's only ISO 500. Watch what happens if I go to all my settings and turn them off, okay? No sharpening, no noise reduction. Even at 200%, we still have a clean image here, despite a little bit of color noise and things like that. Let's go to Lightroom Defaults now. This is Lightroom Defaults on this image. It's ISO 500. There's not a lot of noise. So in this case, I don't need to add a ton of grain, but that's why here I've made a low ISO Filmic to add a little bit of grain and get me kind of a nice texture to the image that just feels natural and consistent. You would be surprised if you have a little bit of banding in the sky or some weird inconsistency or artifacting, how much grain can do. So yes, I'm adding grain even to my images that are low ISO. Now, I usually add this in the final output. A lot of times if I'm running all these presets and then I say, hey, I'm gonna go to Photoshop and I'm gonna do Blackroom, or I'm gonna do Lumist, or I'm gonna do some manual burn and dodging, or do some glow effects, I'll actually reset my details, my sharpening, my grain, etc., just leaving kind of the baselines. Obviously, I don't wanna take a bunch of color noise into Photoshop, but I do find basic noise reduction in these environments works best on your original RAW file. So I'll do the basic noise reduction, but I might leave that grain off to go into something like Photoshop. Number one, because I might add grain over there, or number two, because if I don't, I can come back and just add the grain at the end on my final image that I've saved out of Photoshop. I don't want to be doubling up, because if I take grain into Photoshop and then run a bunch of effects, artifacts can actually start building up on that as we layer up and layer up. But for now, we're just focusing on these raw processors, not pixel editors like Photoshop or Luminar, raw processors like Lightroom and Capture One, because in my experience, it's best to deal with your subtle details in the raw file, just like it's best to deal with basic exposure, shadow, and highlight settings and those kind of things when you have the raw file with every ounce of information. Here's one taken on a Fuji file at ISO 2500, so very similar to that ISO 3200 image that we did a minute ago. And you can see as I zoom in here, and let's kind of reset, there's no grain, and this is default sharpening, right? Again, I've applied a light preset for processing from Natural HDR. Let's look at what our original looked like. Here was our original right here. And so you can see that I went in here and I brought in some dynamic range and tweaked the color, the white balance a little bit. Looks pretty good. We're at 200 again. Are you seeing maybe a little bit of that worminess coming in right here in the nose? Let's turn the sharpening way up. See what I mean, right? But we don't need to sharpen this that much. All we actually need to do is apply a little grain. So I'm gonna save time, but I'm gonna show you what's happening. Here's our sharpening and grain settings. You can see they're at default right now. I'm gonna go to this preset I made, low ISO Filmic, and apply that. And boom, now we've just added, not a super intense, because this isn't super noisy, right? But we've added this. We went from here to here, okay? And yeah, look at this full screen if you need to, because we're looking at very fine details, but here is our settings. A little noise reduction, a little bit of sharpening, and of course, some grain right down here. You can copy these settings yourself and get the same results. Let's switch to something though that's a little more high ISO. Here is a 10,000. This is again on a full frame. Let's look at this one. We could go and do something like Street Bitch or something like that, right? So just to simulate kind of a normal process. And you can see we're at ISO 10,000 on the Sony, quite a bit of grain, but guess what? I probably already added it. The preset I just added applied the grain. Let's take our grain and details away. Here's what it was like default, right? The developed settings are there, but these are default Lightroom sharpening, noise reduction, and no grain. A lot of noise. Let's do the high ISO Filmic, which is basically the formula I just showed you. Wow. Sometimes you're gonna look at these and you're gonna say, oh, well, okay, fine. Other times you're just gonna be like, okay, wow. Because the power in these is self-evident. We went from this to this. At 200%, you can see that we do lose a tiny bit of detail, but it looks good. And now we zoom out to 1:1, 100%, or we zoom out to normal, and we just have a nice clean image with grain texture. You can decide, guys, how much grain, how much sharpening. You can tweak with all these settings right over here to your heart's content, even if you start with a preset to save time. But the point that you need to understand is that you don't have to be fretting about your noise, because your noise can be converted to nice, filmic, organic feeling texture. Let's go to that 5D Mark II image that we were talking about at the very beginning and how terrible it was. Again, here is default Lightroom settings with the current process version. This is super noisy. Let's put the high ISO Filmic on there and look what happens. Sure, it's not quite as sharp, but it looks so much better and so less artifacted. So we had this one right here that we just edited. Let's go to a Fuji file and I will show you this one. Let's reset our detail. For point of reference, I'm actually going to put a color image on this just so we're kind of seeing a fair comparison. So let me find a color. I actually like this image because of all the coloring that was going on. I like this better in black and white, but let me actually go down to Filmist on this and find a Filmist look like Agfa Flex. Now, if we come in here at 200%, you can see there is a lot of artifacting on the faces, on the balloons. There's a lot going on. You can see some of that worminess that people sometimes talk about with Lightroom that you're gonna see when I do the other video, that it's kind of present everywhere. It's just the way the raw processors are interpreting artifacts and data and noise. But let's make it simple. We're at ISO 10,000 on this one. Let's put the high ISO Filmic on here. And yes, we just did that. Of course, we could adjust this up or down and see, look what happens. As I turn the grain down, it's more digital feeling. It's a little sharper, but it's more artificial. As soon as I add that grain in whatever amount I want, the texture starts to even out. And what was artifacts and noise becomes blended in with simply texture. That's at ISO 10,000 on a crop sensor. Honestly, it's a little more noisy, but our ISO 10,000 on a full frame sensor right here is a little cleaner, logically so, because it's a full frame sensor, but it's not honestly that much different. The bottom line is you can apply this technique to absolutely any image. Thank you all. I hope you found this useful. I hope this was like a little class in using your noise and turning that noise into something useful and organic and beautiful, because it actually can be. So stop worrying about noise, start leveraging your noise, because leverage, whether it's business or marketing or editing or whatever you're doing, when you give yourself leverage, give yourself tools and techniques, you can play with these sliders and make your own presets. If you want to have my high ISO preset, I'll put it in the Filmist free pack. So by the time you're watching this, it should be in there, and I'll link it in the comments, or you can go to seimfx.com/filmist. If you like these kind of videos, please like, please subscribe, please comment. Tell me what you think. Am I on point or am I crazy? Noise reduction should be subtle. It's about balance. Then you combine that if needed with grain. And frankly, in my opinion, I don't want a digital artificial artifacted image. And so even on clean images that are low noise, I will generally apply a little bit of grain. Sometimes I'll do it right at the end and I'll edit and tweak or go into Photoshop or do what I need. But then on my output, I'll put some of that grain because I want that rich, organic feel. All right, you guys, peace, and we'll see you on the next one.